So, Bertrand, you wrote and edited a book called Organizational Learning and Competitive Advantage. And it's been about 20 years now, but it's really still very much a classic. And so we really wanted to kind of revisit some of the concepts in the book. And I'd like to start by asking you why you wrote that book.
Yeah, and as you said, time is flying. It's a long time ago, but I think the main reason why we made the decision to write this book is because it was fun. It was fun and it was an exciting project. At that time, I had the great honor to be invited as a visiting professor at the Harvard Business School and to work closely with Chris Argyris. Chris Argyris was a leading scholar in the field of organizational behavior and is very often referred as the father of organizational learning. So for me, it was an amazing year there and really a great learning opportunity. And I have to say that I really appreciated working with Chris Argyris because he's one of the few scholars who really, let's say, walk the talk. He has been advocating learning for many, many years, but he was essentially learning oriented himself. And I have to say that it's not so common. I have had the opportunity to work with many colleagues, especially in the field of leadership, and sometimes there is a big gap between what people preach as scholars and the way they behave themselves. If you have a look to the way they treat their assistant, for instance, you would say, oh, there is quite a gap between what I can read in the books and the way they behave. In the case of Chris Argyris, it was the exact opposite. He was perfectly sincere and his behavior was totally aligned with his theory of learning. So that was basically the context in which I studied this project. And Chris introduced me to Amy Edmondson. And Amy became a co-author and a good friend. And we have been working together for more than 20 years now. And Amy is now, of course, on the faculty of Harvard. She has a chair there. At that time, she was just completing a PhD. And when the book was published, she just joined the faculty of Harvard. And we have had very interesting conversation with Chris and with Amy, of course, about organizational learning. But my background was in strategy. And we had very interesting discussion about how could we bridge those two fields, the field of organization behavior on one hand, and the field of strategy on the other hand. And at that time, there was something new in the field of strategy was the notion of resource-based, which is basically the idea that companies can gain a competitive advantage through leveraging their internal resources. And we said here there is something on which we could work, and that's how we studied this project. And it was really fun, and we had the impression to be explorers. Exploring a new field, exploring something new. So with a lot of intellectual excitement there.
What exactly is the central theme or thesis of the book?
So our main ambition was really to bridge organization behavior and strategy. And the central idea is that competitive advantage can be obtained by focusing on the human factor and what we called learning capabilities. So that was really the main central idea in the book. And in fact, it's possible to develop a low-cost strategy or to introduce innovations that will provide you a competitive advantage. But what we know, it is not sustainable. So in fact, what is important is not to introduce innovation or the capacity to be cost effective, is to do that in the long term, on an ongoing way. So the real source of competitive advantage, if we think about innovation, is the capacity to introduce on an ongoing way innovation on the marketplace. So then you turn from the technology, the innovation itself, to the process that is behind that allows innovation to happen to be in the marketplace. So that's really the central idea in this book. And just to illustrate that, I remember years ago I have had a conversation with CEO of a company was in the making handset mobile telephones, and he was a manufacturer, and he was very proud of his new mobile. So he said, "Okay, this is really the killer mobile. With that, we are going to have a huge success." And in fact, they have had a huge success during 6 months. The problem, the year after, they disappeared. And that's an illustration that it's not innovation. One innovation is very often not enough. What is required is the capacity to innovate. That's what we call a learning capability. In this case, they didn't have this learning capability. And I think it is even more relevant today as companies, they need to develop what I call strategic ambidexterity. Companies now need, on one hand, to be operationally excellent, and on the other hand, they need to be innovative. And those two things, they require that companies acquire learning capabilities.
When you wrote the book, who was the target audience that you had in mind specifically, and what were you hoping they would take away from it?
Yeah, I would say, to be honest, we wrote the book for ourselves because we thought it was fun and we were learning while we were doing that. But of course, that's a good reason. But of course, we also had in mind that if we were excited with this topic, we thought that other scholars would also be excited with this topic. And as we have had the opportunity to make different presentations and do some action research in companies, we also observed that executives consider this topic as being very relevant. So those kind of executives, we call them reflective practitioners, of people who are interesting to reflect on their own practice. They are clearly part of the target for this group. And of course, PhD students, MBA students, traditional market for book in management. And you had the question about the main takeaway. But for me, the main takeaway would be it is essential to develop learning capabilities in companies. If you want to have a competitive advantage, you need to work hard and you need to leverage the human capital in your company. That's basically the main takeaway for the readers of this book.
How do you define a learning organization today?
So a learning organization, technically, it's a field of research. And learning organization refers to a subcategory of the literature on organizational learning. It's a little bit technical. So the broad term is organizational learning. And there are different ways to study organizational learning. One is to have the ambition to describe the phenomenon. And a lot of books, articles have been published with this intention in mind, is to provide a very interesting description of a phenomenon. For instance, you have people who studied what we call organizational routines and how those routines become part of the memory of the organization. So learning is basically to create new routines that will be part of the memory of the organization. If we think about an airline company, people may leave, but the way to operate, the way how to fly an airplane, those are based on routines that are independent of the people. So that's one field of research. The other field of research is with the intention not to be descriptive, but to be prescriptive, to tell people how to improve the situation, how to build what we call a learning organization. So learning organization refers to this subcategory of the literature on organizational learning that is prescriptive. And the ambition of the authors here is to produce actionable knowledge, knowledge that can be used by the readers in order to make change happen in their organizations. So that's definition of organizational learning. I want to be more precise about the word learning. Technically, learning occurs when members of an organization identify a problem. So they identify a problem, a gap, and they correct it. So learning is about identifying a problem and solving the problem, correcting the problem. A non-learning organization would be an organization that would do the same errors again and again. And unfortunately, when we observe organization, it's quite common to see that organizations don't learn. They are just repeating the same problem, the same errors. I mentioned that it's identifying the gap between what I did and what I wanted to do, but it's also looking to the future, identifying the gap between what I would like to do, which kind of company I would like to build, what is the vision, and where are we today? So here there is also a learning journey to move from point A today to point B in 5 years, for instance, if you have a 5-year plan, how to make the vision become a reality. This is also part of the way we define a learning organization. Learning is really required for a vision to be translated into reality. And when we think about competitive advantage, this is something important. And learning was about either being operationally excellent or being innovative. That's the way we define learning. So in order to study that, we introduce, in fact, two notions. The notion of learning how and learning why.
How and why. Okay.
In fact, learning how refers to the capability to improve existing processes in companies. Total quality management, zero defects, Six Sigma, Kaizen, all those methods, they have been built to develop such capabilities in companies, within companies. Nowadays, with the possibility to connect all products to internet, we call that the Internet of Things or the Internet of Everything. Combining that with big data, here we have new hot topics, and they can be used to develop a new kind of operational effectiveness, operational excellence. So this has to do with learning how, developing learning how capabilities within companies. And again, Internet of Things, Internet of Everything for me is really the future in this direction. Learning how refers to doing more of the same, but doing it better. It's what we call a logic of exploitation. We know how to do things, but we are going to exploit it and do it better. We can contrast that with learning why. Learning why is different. It's a capability to diagnose complex situations, to test new ideas, to experiment, to innovate. And this time, learning why refers not to a logic of exploitation, but to a logic of exploration. The capacity to explore new territories, new opportunities. So learning why is required when you want to design radical innovation, disruptive innovation, for instance. And nowadays, the environment has never been so hard to decipher, so unpredictable, so complex. And we think that the learning why capability is probably more critical than when it was before. And we all know that old recipes, they don't work anymore. I've been in the field of executive education for many years, and when we discuss with CEOs, it's clear that they have lost their repère. They don't necessarily know what to do because the way they have been behaving, the way they have been leading the company, it just doesn't work anymore. So it's not this time doing more of the same. It's really the capacity that is required to revisit the way they manage a company, they lead a company, and this requires what we call the learning why capability.
What are a few examples of great learning organizations that you can think of?
I'm going to speak about examples that we used in the book, because those were the examples on which we built to really develop this approach based on learning how and learning why. We picked two companies that at that time were very successful. The first one was Intel Corporation. Intel. And to be honest, we selected Intel in our sample because we thought Intel had a competitive advantage thanks to its capacity to innovate. And when we started studying more closely Intel, when we went to a field, we interviewed experts, we learned that, of course, Intel was innovative, but basically Intel was not more innovative than its competitors. So if the company is not more innovative than its competitors, by definition, it's a source of competitive advantage. You are not better than the others, you are just like the others. So the research question became, how can it be that Intel has a competitive advantage? And what was the source of the competitive advantage? And what we discovered is, in fact, that there was a unique capability within Intel. They developed the capacity to move very efficiently and very fast from R&D to large-scale production. So this capability has been developed thanks to a methodology they designed, which is, the name of the methodology is copy exactly. So the idea is it's standardization of manufacturing processes. But thanks to this extreme standardization of the processes, they have been able to develop a unique capacity to move very efficiently from R&D to large-scale production. They were much better than their competitors in this specific era. And this has nothing to do with innovation. Of course, they were innovative, but they were not more innovative. They were just better at doing this, at doing more of the same. And in other words, they were very good at learning how. So that's the first example we used was really this company, Intel, with a notion of copy exactly as an example of learning how capability. The second example was a consulting firm, which was very successful at that time. The name of the firm was Monitor Company, Monitor. It was based in Cambridge, and it has been set up by Harvard professors. And Chris Argyris intervened during several years in Monitor to promote learning. And he invited us, Amy and me, he invited us to do a field study to see to what extent he has been successful or not developing this learning capability within Monitor. And it's not very common that a researcher asks two young colleagues, especially a very well-known scholar, so that also show you that he was really learning oriented, to say, okay, let's go on, give me a feedback, what do you think? And basically the conclusion was that Monitor had acquired a unique capability to diagnose complex problems, to deal productively with challenging situations. And we draw the conclusion that this was an explanation of their competitive advantage at that time. And in other words, we concluded that they had developed a learning why capabilities, and that these learning why capabilities explain their competitive advantage they had at that time. But those are two examples that you can find in the book.
I'd like to hear you talk more about why organizational learning is a competitive advantage, and what are the challenges with that come along with it?
It is a competitive advantage because it's very hard to duplicate. Companies who want to go in this direction, they realize that it's a long learning journey. It takes time, it takes commitment to do that. If it was easy to do, then this would not be a source of competitive advantage. So, which is not necessarily good news for the readers of the book, but people need a real commitment if they really want to build a learning organization. And especially a commitment of the employees and a commitment of the senior management of the company. And this is especially true for learning-wide capabilities. It requires a capacity of what we call of self-awareness. Very often, the main obstacle we need to deal with when we do interventions in companies to help them building those learning capabilities, the main obstacle, it's not a technical one. It has to do with the mental models of the people in the company. In order to go in the direction of a learning organization, people need to accept to change. And this is not easy. And the most challenging thing is to accept to change when things go well. Because when things go well, you think there is no reason to change. And sometimes companies wait until they are in a kind of crisis situation to accept to enter in the learning cycle. So it's really important that in companies, people develop this capacity, this self-awareness capacity. It's much easier when you face a problem, for instance, to blame the customers if you can't sell a product. You say, oh, because the customers don't have good taste. Or if you are not very successful and you lose market shares, then you are going to blame the competitors who are too aggressive. And in learning organization, the first thing is to blame yourself, to see what should you have done differently in order to avoid being trapped in this situation. So this is what we call about self-awareness, acting as a reflective practitioner. And in learning organization, they have to develop what we call an organization to learn mindset. Amy introduced this notion in a more recent book on teaming, the notion of organizing to learn mindset. So it's really a change at the level of the mindset of the people in the company.
How should a leader go about building a learning culture in their organization?
Yeah, that's a critical question. And for me, that's really the starting point to the direction of building a learning organization. It requires a transformational leader. I'm currently working on this, on a book on this topic. This leader needs to be able to build trust in his company. And it's interesting because trust, it's not very well studied in the field of management, but it's a critical question, a critical notion too. It's not easy to deal with this notion of trust. And I think we need to make a distinction between two forms of trust. What we call trust in competencies. Are we able to learn? And trust in intentions. Are people sincere? Are they really willing to learn? Are they committed? So in a learning culture, the leader actually needs to work on this notion of trust. Also, the leader needs to promote a culture in which you are allowed to fail. And as we mentioned, learning, it's about correcting errors. And especially if you want to develop learning-wide capabilities, if you want to develop innovations, you need to accept that failure is part of the learning journey. So in a certain extent, you can encourage people to fail as long as they learn when they fail. So when you explore innovative value proposition, you need to fail in order to learn. You can have a look to the vast majority of innovation. It's a real long learning journey. And needs to be very clear that failure is part of this learning journey. The leaders, they need to be authentic. They need to act consistently with what they preach. The worst situation is when they preach that, okay, I encourage people to experiment, and if someone experiments and if the person fails, then they will blame the person. This is not the kind of culture you need to have. The final thing is, in order to promote such a learning culture, the leaders, they should ask to be challenged themselves. They should not try to control everything and try to impose their view. They should empower people in the organization and encourage people to learn in the organization.
Are there any other types of characteristics or skills that a leader needs to possess in order to really drive a learning organization?
They need to be learning oriented. They need to be learning oriented. And I remember a story that employees of a large IT service company told me one day. A consultant made a big mistake and the company lost a big contract. The consultant has been asked to meet with the CEO, and the people thought that this guy, he will have to leave the company. And during the meeting, the CEO asked just one question. He asked him, what did you learn? And as the consultant has been able to provide convincing answers, the CEO told him, okay, let's put this cost on our training budget. To be honest, I don't know if this actually happened or not. But what is important is that in the company, this kind of story, people tell this story, it circulates in the company, and it tells something about the kind of culture that exists in this company.
How does a leader go about defining and finding the right people for their organization?
I would say the right people are the people who are eager to learn. Those who demonstrate self-awareness or a willingness to go in this direction, activity. At the opposite, the wrong people are those who are full of certainties, those who are full of conviction that they are right, they have nothing to learn. I was in charge of a team of 250 people at HEC Paris, and I tried to implement what I preach regarding organizational learning, and we have been quite successful. So I would say we have been able to a certain extent to develop a competitive advantage. We multiplied by 15 the revenue. We moved from 23 to number 1 in the rankings. But for me, this has been achieved thanks to the team. And I know that in the team, I could count on the people. I could count on the people. And I also learned that I was able to deal with people who make errors. Okay, as long as it was not intentional, and as long as people were sincere, that they were doing their best. But at the opposite, I also learned that I could work with people who, when they were confronted to direct observable data that clearly show that they made an error, and the people, they become defensive and they start blaming all the others except themselves, I know that I just can't work with those people. Those are not the right people you need to have in an organization when you want to develop organizational learning.
What type of behaviors should a company promote or cultivate to build a learning culture within?
All behaviors that demonstrate that people do not use defensive reasoning. They should be engaged in a learning cycle, and each time they do something, it should be a learning opportunity for them. They need to use what we call a productive reasoning. Instead of trying to impose their views on the others, they should inquire. They should try to understand why other people may have a different view and learn from that. And a disagreement should not be a confrontation, but should be a learning opportunity for those people.
What types of resources do you need to build a learning culture? For instance, how much do you allocate to learning and development versus other types of resources?
I would say there is no easy answer to that question. For sure, it's important that companies allocate a significant amount of money to lifelong learning, for sure. But I would not restrict the question about building a learning culture to how much do they allocate for learning and development. Because for me, I also believe that learning should also occur on the job, not only in training or executive education programs, but also while people are working in the company. Each time employees identify a problem, try to solve it, in fact, they engage in the learning journey. And for me, companies pay employees to learn while they work, or they should pay employees to learn while they work. So it's a huge budget.
How do you go about developing a learning plan for individuals and teams within the organization?
I would say for individuals, they can attend executive programs dedicated to develop their self-awareness, their reflexivity. Team level, I would say each time the team members are engaged in problem setting and problem solving activities. At the organizational level, I would say at the level of the executive committee, at the top of the organization, they need to walk the talk. So their responsibility is also to set up learning mechanisms. For instance, I worked as a consultant for a law firm, and in this firm, they have a routine at the organizational level that requires that after each assignment, the lawyers write a memo to explain what they learned during this assignment. And this memo is now accessible by all lawyers in the firm. This is something that exists at the level of a company and that really contributes to promote the learning culture in the company.
How do you recommend developing learning goals? How does that process work?
I would say there are two ways. There is a top-down approach when it has to do with the vision of becoming a learning organization. This has to be part of the strategic vision of the company. It's also top-down as we consider that executives should be role models for people in the company. But it's also bottom-up because, as I mentioned before, learning on the job is responsibility of all employees in companies. And also employees can learn something and make this sort of learning available for other colleagues in the company. So this is not only a top-down or bottom-up, but this is also transversal approach.
What type of learning methods do you think should be used generally in an organization? Is there something you recommend, or is it different for everyone?
Companies use a mix of formal and informal learning. What I mean by formal learning is to set up sessions, working with business school to develop executive programs in order to promote learning. And also informal learning is to encourage people to work when they work in the company, to learn when they work in the company, and to share what they learn in the company. So to actively contribute to knowledge management and learning within the company. from the perspective of the business schools, I think we need to move from a model of being professors, being the wise on stage, to acting as a guide on the side. So we are here to facilitate. We also, I think, should contribute to promote learning by leveraging what people already know. I will just illustrate that when you facilitate an executive program, I don't say necessarily teach, but when you facilitate a program, in fact, in the room, let's say you have a group of 30 people. In fact, very often you have, in fact, 600 years of cumulative experience in the room. And I see the role of the professor here to leverage this 600 years of cumulative experience in the benefit of a collective learning. Of course, the professor did some research, is an expert in the field. But if you just preach and you come with concepts, people will not necessarily learn. People will learn through the interaction between the research that the professor has done and what they already know and what they have already experienced. And sharing, organizing a knowledge sharing forum is something very key to promote learning.